In today's lecture, we are going to talk about the land of Canaan and its peoples. If you look at this map, this is the Middle East in ancient times. And on your upper left corner, you see Asia Minor, what today is Turkey. And then as you go below, on the lower left, you see Egypt. Between Asia Minor and Egypt, there's a section of territory that today would comprise Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. In general, in ancient times, we call this the land of Canaan. And this term actually comes from biblical references. So while it is not well defined, it is that general area. And whoever lives there is called a Canaanite. And of course, defining what a Canaanite is also quite difficult because they're not a single group. It's not a monolithic group. What we do know about them is that they have probably the same language or similar languages or dialects of the same language, a similar culture, similar religious beliefs, and obviously they interacted politically, economically, socially in ancient times. So right here, we see the location of Canaan on the lower left corner in relation to some of the other great civilizations or states of the ancient Middle East. So to the right, you see Sumeria or Sumer. We have spoken about the Sumerians before, and of course, that is southern Mesopotamia. As we go up, we see Assyria, and we will talk later about the Assyrians. And then to the left, you see the kingdom of Mari. Mari was that powerful city as kingdom center in the city of the same name. And then you have the kingdom of Ebla. Ebla was also a powerful city in Syria. All of this, by the way, are Semitic, with the exception of the Sumerians, of course, they are Semitic peoples, that is, peoples who speak a Semitic language. And then to the south, you see that strip of land that we call Canaan, which has the Mediterranean on the west, and it is flanked by hills and eventually by the Syrian desert on the right. This area of the Middle East has been inhabited since very early. Remember that this is one of the areas where people from Africa came through as they populated the earth. So there has been a human presence there for thousands of years. Actually, there were Neanderthals there before there were Homo sapiens in that area. And some of these, and agriculture develops there also quite early. It is, after all, part of what we call the Fertile Crescent. And right here we have the image of the ruins of Megiddo. You're probably familiar with this, but by a different name, Armageddon. You probably have heard that Armageddon is the last battle in the days when the world is going to end. Well, the origin of that term comes from this city. There were several major battles that took place here. And when biblical writers spoke about the end of the world, they decided to use this reference as their analogy to the end of the world and the big battle. Historically, we know that Megiddo was an important city. These are some of the remnants of that city, and as you can see, still very fertile all around. So there are many cities like this. They are city-states, and sometimes the city-states form confederations to either defend themselves from attackers or sometimes to attack enemies. And very often, of course, they're also going to be fighting against each other. The inhabitants of Megiddo are in all likelihood Semites, meaning that they speak a Semitic language. Another important city in this area is the city of Ugarit, which flourished between 1800 and 1200 BC. Ugarit is also of Semitic origin. It was a trading post. It was a very important commercial center. And the people of Ugarit are very important culturally because of one of their inventions. The people of Ugarit developed a cuneiform alphabet. That is a system that only has a few symbols that can represent every sound in a language and therefore enable the users to reproduce any words or any thoughts. This is extremely important because if you remember, the original cuneiform system was a logographic system of about 600 symbols. Each symbol represented many things. Sometimes it represented a sound, sometimes it represented a word, sometimes it represented a syllable, sometimes it represented a grammatical concept. It was extremely complicated to use, and that's why people who were able to read and write in that system were highly rewarded, and they actually had a high social standing in Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern societies. So what the people of Ugarit did is that they took the symbols from the cuneiform system, but they applied a completely different use to them. So in this case, each symbol represents a sound. And if you notice here, there's something interesting about this system. There are only consonants. There are no vowels. And this is something that a lot of the Semitic languages inherit, where a word is written only with consonants and you have to kind of guess the vowel that goes in between. That's true for Arabic, that's true for Hebrew, and it's a peculiarity of the languages of the Semites. Why is this so important? Well, this is very important because in order to learn how to use 600 symbols, you have to, it's like going to the university and getting a PhD. It's extremely complicated to develop proficiency in the cuneiform system. To learn 22 symbols and how to use them, that is something that is actually quite doable for, let's say, a merchant. Literacy is really revolutionized with the use of alphabet. Now, this Ugaritic alphabet was not widespread, it was local, but at least we know that the idea already exists. So the people of Ugarit are quite important. And actually, they were also very, they did develop a whole genre of literature, basically poetry. Ugaritic poetry was widespread, and in the Hebrew Bible, for example, we see traces of the influence of Ugarit in the composition of poetry. One section of Canaan, what today is Lebanon, basically, was called Phoenicia because it was inhabited by the Phoenicians, a local Canaanite people, also of Semitic origin. And you can see that most of their cities are located along the sea. The Phoenicians developed a brilliant civilization, and they are very important in the establishment of, in the spread of certain cultural benchmarks throughout the Mediterranean. A lot of the cities still exist: Tripoli, Byblos, Beirut, Sidon, Acre. These are cities, Tyre, the city of Tyre. These are cities that are still quite vibrant today. So for a city to exist for 3,000-4,000 years continuously is quite an achievement. But the achievement of the Phoenicians is greater than just survival. The Phoenicians were probably the greatest sailors of ancient times. Right here, we have a depiction of what a typical Phoenician vessel was like. These vessels were seaworthy, meaning that you could go out into open sea. This is a typical small vessel. As you can see, it has a simple sail. It has ballast at the bottom to balance the boat, and it's basically a cargo ship. These vessels crisscross the Mediterranean, trading very important goods. And right here on the right, what you see is a replica. This was a modern reproduction of what a Phoenician vessel probably looked like. The one thing that I probably wouldn't agree with is the purple color. And you'll see why. Purple was very expensive to produce, so they would probably not put so much purple on a sail. So most likely the sails only had, they were just white. But other than that, it's actually a very accurate reproduction of what a Phoenician vessel looked like. Between 1800 and around 600 BC, the Phoenicians, out of what today is Lebanon, spread throughout the Mediterranean and built colonies. They built colonies in Egypt, in Cyprus, the island that you see close to Lebanon, to the Middle East. And then they sailed outward, and they built colonies in what today would be Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Sicily in Italy, the island of Sardinia in Italy, the Balearic Islands in what today is Spain, and the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, southern part of Spain, as you can see on this map. Everything that you see shaded in green are areas of Phoenician colonization. Now, what does colonization mean in the context of the Phoenicians? When you think of colonies, you think of the American colonies, where you have the British taking possession of territories in the name of their sovereign, of their king. Or you think of the Spanish colonies in the Americas, where they took control over, let's say, Mexico or Peru, and they created a dependency of the mother country. That is not what colonization meant for the Phoenicians. Because, first of all, Phoenicia is not a single state. Phoenicia is a collection of independent city-states. Beirut, Tyre, Byblos, Sidon, all of these city-states have their own king, their own laws, their own system of running things. What they have in common is their culture, their language, their ethnicity, and their trade connections. So building a colony means setting up a trading post in a foreign land, not conquering that land. So, for example, if you build a colony in Sicily, that island south of Italy, you can see Italy right there in the center, has the shape of a boot. So if you build a colony in Sicily, what that means is that you have contact with the local people, the Siculi or Sicils. Those are where the original inhabitants of Sicily. You probably trade with them, develop a trading relationship, you buy and sell stuff from them. And at one point, you ask permission. Can we have our own little settlement here so that we can trade permanently? And the locals say yes, because it is in their benefit to have Phoenicians there. Having Phoenicians means that they have access to a whole network of trade, and that's very important. Eventually, the Phoenicians will build up their little settlement into a city. Some of the locals will intermarry with the Phoenicians, and eventually a local Phoenician culture, a local Phoenician state develops there. And that happened many times, as you can see along these green sections. So if you are a Phoenician, you can go to these places and they will speak your language. The Phoenician language is a Semitic language. So they speak your language. They have the same religion as they have in the Middle East, in Phoenicia. And you are welcome if you come in goodwill to trade. The Phoenicians were in the business of business. They were in the business of trading, of producing wealth. And they are going to go in many directions. Eventually, there's going to be a network of Phoenician colonies that will be very important for the diffusion not only of goods, but also for the diffusion of culture. Of all the colonies built by the Phoenicians, the most important one was Carthage in North Africa. And you see it right there in the center. In what today is Tunisia, the city of Carthage eventually will become a powerhouse. And at one point, they will become an empire. And we'll talk about that much later in the course. Right here, you can see an example of two Phoenician cities located in what today is Lebanon. On the left, you have the city of Arwad, and on the right, the city of Tyre. And what they both have in common is that they are islands. So these city-states are really built as naval bases. You see very clearly in the image on the left, which is a satellite image, how there is an artificial harbor that has been built to protect the vessels. And of course, the city was completely surrounded with walls for its defense. So it's a pretty impregnable city. And when you look at the right, the city of Tyre was also built on an island, and it was well defended. Of course, it could not resist Alexander the Great. Later in history, Alexander will conquer the city by basically filling in the space between Tyre and the mainland with rubble. And today, if you look at a map of Tyre, it doesn't look like an island, but as a peninsula, because what Alexander did, uh, he connected it to the mainland so he could conquer the city. But what this tells you is that there's a high degree of engineering technology that the Phoenicians have developed in building their cities. The Phoenicians were indeed the greatest navigators of ancient times, and they accomplished significant feats of navigation. One of them, and we are not very sure about it, but there are references to it, and we believe that it's likely to be true, is about a trip around Africa, the circumnavigation of the African continent. Sometime around 600 BC, King Necho, who was an Egyptian pharaoh, an Egyptian ruler, commissioned a group of Phoenician sailors to find a way around Africa. And a fleet is built, and we don't know how many vessels, but we gather it's probably a couple. And they depart from what today would be Egypt along the Red Sea. They travel south into the Indian Ocean, and they explore the eastern coast of Africa. At one point, they land in an area. They plow the fields to cultivate wheat. They wait for the wheat to be harvested, and they move on. And they did this over the course of 3 years until they sailed up the Atlantic into the Mediterranean and returned to Egypt. Now, this sounds quite extraordinary. But there are a couple of facts, there are a couple of details actually about the account that lead historians to believe that this actually happened. And one of them is that the narrator of this trip, and of course this is not a first-hand account, is probably second, third, fourth-hand account of the trip. But what we know from the narrative is that as the Phoenicians sail south, every morning they see the sun rising on their left side. But then they say that something strange happens. As they are sailing back home, they start to see that the sun has shifted. So every morning, the sun rises on the right hand. And what this depicts is basically the Phoenicians going all the way down to the tip of Africa, turning, going into the Atlantic, and then sailing north. This detail leads historians to believe that this may have actually happened. So if they actually carried out this feat, it is one of the most amazing voyages in the history of exploration. Another important voyage carried out by the Phoenicians is the one carried by Hanno, the navigator. And we know about this trip because a Greek historian went to the city of Carthage. Hanno was from the city of Carthage, one of the cities founded by the Phoenicians. So a Greek historian went to the city of Carthage, and he read something called the Periplus. A periplus is an account of a voyage. And what happened is that in Carthage, there was a temple to the god Baal. Baal was the main god of the Phoenicians. And when a captain came back from a long trip, he would actually put an account of his trip inside the temple, usually written on a wooden tablet. So according to this Greek traveler, he went to Carthage, he visited the temple, and he actually read the Periplus, the account of the voyage of Hanno. And Hanno says that he went out through the Pillars of Hercules. That's the Strait of Gibraltar. That's that narrow passage that you see between North Africa and Spain. And he went then down the coast of Africa for many, many weeks. He talks about seeing a volcano erupt. And then he also claims that they captured these, that on one place they found these very hairy humans, and they were very strong. And they captured one of the females, and eventually they had to kill that female. And they were surprised by the way they looked, and they called these people gorillas. So most likely, what they found was not humans, but either the actual gorillas that we know today, or quite likely chimpanzees, which they mistook for some sort of human species. But it's fascinating because that means that Hanno must have traveled all the way to equatorial Africa, as you can see in this map. Some historians think that because of the description that he gives about the volcano erupting, he must have reached what today is the country of Cameroon. And we know that he went back and he was able to get provisions on one of the colonies that existed along the western coast of Africa. This is just one of many accounts of travels. We know that other Phoenician or Carthaginian sailors reach what today is Britain, and there are even accounts of people going far into the northern seas. So the contribution in terms of navigation of the Phoenicians is quite important. The Phoenicians were traders. They traded everything that they could. Their aim in life was to conduct business and to generate wealth, and they were very good at it. And one of their sources of wealth was the production of a dye known as Tyrian purple. Tyrian, as in the city of Tyre, which was one of the main Phoenician cities. Natural dyes were very expensive in ancient times. So you can imagine that most people wore very either white natural cloth from linen, for example, or just wool. Dye clothing was very expensive. It was only for wealthier people because the production of dyes was very time consuming. It required a lot of work. The Phoenicians produced this very special type of dye, which was purple, and it came out of that little mollusk that you see, that little animal. It's called the murex. Now, the murex is a scavenger, so basically it crawls at the bottom of the sea, and it eats dead matter. So it stings a lot. And then what you do is you open it, and it has a little pouch, and that little pouch contains a tiny drop of a very deep purple dye. You process that into the powder that you see there, and then you can use that to color clothing. You would need thousands and thousands and thousands of these little mollusks to produce the dye that you see there. And that means that this purple dye is extremely expensive. Eventually, purple comes to be identified as the color of the royalty because only kings could afford it. What we have also discovered is that this murex was not hunted or gathered in the wild. Archaeologists have found on some Phoenician archaeological sites thousands and thousands of these, and they have a little hole at the top, and it's like someone took a drill and bored a hole on their shell. And it turns out that that was not made by humans. It was made by other murex. This happens when you put a single species in a confined space. They start to cannibalize each other. So what happened is that this murex that had the little hole had been eaten by other murex. It was the other murex that drilled the hole to eat what was inside. And what that tells you is that these murex were being harvested in fisheries. So these things were not found in the wild. The Phoenicians bred them and put them in these huge fisheries to obtain the purple. Perhaps the most important contribution of the Phoenicians is the alphabet. Now, we already spoke about the Ugaritic alphabet. That was a cuneiform alphabet, and it was important because it's the first idea that a symbol can represent a sound only. The Phoenicians take that to the next step, and they produce a set of symbols that eventually will develop into our own alphabet. So right here on this table, you can see, for example, the letter A. It actually develops from a pictograph of an ox. Then it is simplified, and then it's turned around, and the symbol of the ox becomes the Phoenician letter Aleph. The Aleph becomes the alpha in the Greek alphabet, and eventually the letter A in the Latin alphabet of the Romans, which is the one that we use today. So you can see the evolution of a pictographic symbol to the Phoenician version, to the Greek version, to the Latin version that we use today. As I said before, alphabets are a revolution in literacy. Anyone can learn 22, 26 symbols, and this enables more people to read and write. Still, literacy remained very low throughout antiquity, actually throughout history, but this system is not the super complicated system of the Sumerians, which require a full lifetime of education to be proficient in. So eventually the Greeks will adopt the Phoenician alphabet, and the Romans will modify the Greek alphabet into the Latin alphabet that we use today. Another important group of inhabitants of Canaan was the Pelisheth, better known in the biblical writings as the Philistines. The Pelisheth are important because they are part of a group of people known as the Sea Peoples. I have discussed that previously. The Sea Peoples were people from probably some of the Mediterranean islands or some of the coastal areas of the Mediterranean, most likely Indo-Europeans, who around 1200 BC start to appear on the horizon of the Egyptians and the Hittites. They are, I don't want to call them pirates, but they're kind of pirates. They're marauders. Their quest is not to conquer land, but to pillage. And they come in great numbers, and we don't know where they came from exactly, and that's why the Egyptians just called them the Sea Peoples. Now, the Pelisheth were special because they were able to make a pact with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians allowed them to settle in a strip of land that eventually came to be known as Philistia. And from the name Philistia or Philistine comes the name Palestine. So the name Palestine is connected to this Pelisheth. The Pelisheth were sailors, and they were warriors. So when the Egyptians settled them there, the idea was that by settling Pelisheth there, they would help in protecting that land against other sea peoples. And that is a tactic that has been used many times in history by great empires when they are attacked by foreign elements like this. In this map, we can see the Pentapolis. Penta means 5 in Greek, so Pentapolis means 5 cities. These are the 5 city-states that were established by the Philistines in Canaan. And you can see this is a map from around 900 BC. Gaza, Ashkelon, Asdod, Ekron, and Gath. Some of those places still exist. Ashkelon is a city in Israel. Gaza is a city in Palestine. The Philistines, even though their origin might have been Indo-European, once they settled in the area of Canaan, adopted the Canaanite language and many of the Canaanite customs. So they adopted the Semitic language. And they appear as a very powerful state in that region. These Philistine cities were most likely city-states, each one ruled by a king, but very often they acted together. So they did form some sort of confederation to fight their enemies. And they are very important in the biblical writings because they're connected to the beginnings of the kingdom of Israel. As you can see, the Philistines produce very interesting pottery. And the thing about this pottery is that it does resemble, in some ways, the pottery of some of the early Greek uh, civilizations. So, is there a connection between the Philistines and the Greeks? There may be. It hasn't to this day. We don't really know because the language has disappeared. We know from some depictions in the Egyptian sources that maybe because of the type of weapons or headdress that they use, they may be connected to the Greeks. And here we see other examples of the pottery. It is truly amazing that this pottery has survived for almost 3,000 years. But you can see that some of these, again, some of these styles of pottery and the function that the pottery has may be of Indo-European origins. The other important group of Canaanites that emerged in the Middle East during this period in ancient times is the Hebrews. And of course, the Hebrews are known to us because they became the authors of these religious books that now are part of not only the Jewish religious writings, but part of the Christian religious writings. When we talk about the Bible, the Christian Bible, it is divided into the Christian part and the Jewish part. And the Jewish part was produced originally by people connected to the group known as the Hebrews. The first historical reference to the Hebrews might, and the operational word here is might be these documents that appear in an Egyptian city. These are known as the El Amarna letters. El Amarna is a city that was built by Akhenaten. We'll talk about this Egyptian pharaoh later. And there are a lot of these letters, and these are documents written in cuneiform, where the government is in the central government of Egypt is in contact with foreign governments and with local governors. And there is a document where a governor from what today would be the area around Jerusalem writes to the king that he needs archers, that is, warriors who have bow and arrows, because the Hapiru are stealing the cattle and are attacking their cities. So please, Your Majesty, send us archers to protect ourselves from this Hapiru. Some historians believe that this might be the first reference to the Hebrews. The Hebrews might have been, the term Hapiru may not even be an ethnic term, may be a general term for marauders or bandits or something of that sort. The first historical reference to the term Israel comes from the year 1208 BC, and it is contained in the Merneptah stele. Merneptah was a king of Egypt, a pharaoh, and in this document, because it is a document after all, right? It's carved on stone, but it is a document. In this document, he talks about his conquest. He went on campaign into the land of Canaan, and he makes a list of all the cities that he conquered, the people that he defeated, and at one point he says, "And then I came upon the people of Israel, and I crushed them," or something. I'm paraphrasing, but basically he defeated them. What is interesting about this reference is that the king lists both places or countries and peoples that he has defeated. When it comes to the term Israel, the term refers to a group of people and not to a place. So the first reference to the terms Israel is directly in reference to a group of individuals who either call themselves by that name or are called that name by others. And that means that there is no such thing as a country or a land called Israel in this time, but there is a group of people who refer to them as that. Of course, the main source of information about the Hebrews comes from their scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to give you the narrative of the Hebrews based on the Bible, and then we're going to examine that against the archaeological information that we have and other historical sources. So, according to the biblical narrative, there was a man by the name of Abraham who lived in Mesopotamia. Uh, According to one version, he came from the city of Ur of the Chaldees. In another version, he comes from Haran. What is interesting about this is that Ur was an actual city in Mesopotamia, but it was not ruled by the Chaldees. It was a Sumerian city, and then it became an Akkadian city. So when the writer of the scriptures, or this particular part of the scriptures writes, he was born in Ur of the Chaldees, what he's doing is giving a reference about who lived in Mesopotamia at the time that he was writing the story, or after that time. So that's very revealing, because we know that the city existed, but Chaldees or Chaldeans did not rule over the area until much later than the period that the writer is referring to. The other interesting thing about this is that in another part of the scriptures, it is said that Abraham came from Haran. Ur is in the south, Haran is in the north of Mesopotamia. So obviously a discrepancy. So according to the story, God, the God, right, or a God, speaks to him and tells him to go to the land of Canaan. And he travels along with his clan. What is a clan? It's a group of families. Usually these are nomadic people. They are pastoralists, as you can see in this image. They have, mules and donkeys and sheep and goats, and they travel looking for grassland, looking for water holes. And along the way, they often fight over grazing rights, over water rights. And this description of Abraham moving from Mesopotamia to Canaan may be a reference to an early migration, quite likely a violent migration of a group of Semites who lived around Mesopotamia or close to Mesopotamia, and they moved to Canaan. And according to tradition, Abraham becomes the patriarch, the father of the Hebrew people, or the people of Israel as they later come to be known. And there are all kinds of stories. There's a story of Sodom and Gomorrah, these two cities that were they were sinful, and God decides to destroy them because he wants to eradicate sin. There's a story about how God asks Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac, and at the moment that he's about to do it, he says stop. And that, of course, is to illustrate how obedience to God is so important. So this is an early figure, and basically the foundational figure in the narrative of the Hebrews. A few generations go by, and we find ourselves with a fellow by the name of Joseph. Joseph is a descendant of Abraham, and he is one of 12 brothers who used to live in Canaan. According to the story, the brothers of Joseph were very envious of him because he was the favorite of their father, Jacob. So they decide to sell Joseph to a caravan of, slave traders or just people who are passing by. So Joseph is sold as a slave, and he ends up in Egypt. And then in Egypt, through a series of events, he has a dream where he foresees a bad harvest coming in the future. So he is able to tell the Pharaoh, the king, what's going to happen. The Pharaoh prepares. Egypt is spared from the famine because they plan. Planning is very important for any event of this magnitude. And Joseph is rewarded by becoming some sort of minister to the Pharaoh. Because there's famine everywhere else, the brothers of Joseph, with their families and their associates, migrate to Egypt. And when they arrive there, Joseph recognizes them and he forgives them. So he the Pharaoh allows the Hebrews to settle in Egypt. By the way, all of this is according to the biblical narrative. We're not talking yet about historical facts, just part of the biblical narrative. And so the Hebrews settled in the land of Egypt, and according to the account, they prosper. They do quite well. And this, of course, will create the envy and the suspicion on the part of the Egyptians. They feel that this group of people in their midst represents a danger. So what happens? The Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians, decides that he's going to order the killing of all the newborn male babies. And there's one family that has just given birth to, there's one mother who had just given birth to a child, and she decides that because all these babies are being killed by the Egyptians, she's going to put her baby in a basket and is going to allow the current of the river to take the baby along. This story, of course, sounds very much like the story of Sargon the Great. Almost the same. The baby is rescued by the daughter of the Pharaoh. He is raised as a king, as a prince of Egypt. But when he becomes an adult, he finds out his real identity. According to the story, he kills an Egyptian and then he has to escape. As the Hebrews are escaping from Egypt, the Pharaoh decides to change his mind and he goes with his army on pursuit of the Hebrews. And this is when a miraculous event happens, one of many miraculous events in the story. Moses parts the waters of the sea, and the Hebrews are able to cross. And when the Egyptians come down into the empty river, the waters come back and they are drowned. And that enables the Hebrews to escape. And then, as they are making their way to the promised land, which is basically Canaan, where they came from initially, Moses goes up to a mountain where he receives the commandments of God. And these are the commandments that the Hebrews have to live by. Now, because the Hebrews have been sinners, none of the Hebrews who were part of this generation will be allowed to enter the promised land. So it will be up to the next generation. So for 40 years, the Hebrews will wander in the desert before arriving in the land of Canaan. And when they arrive in the land of Canaan, they find that it's occupied. So under the leadership of Joshua, Moses cannot enter the land because he's from the previous generation and he dies before arriving in the promised land. He only can see the promised land from afar. So Joshua is now the leader of the Hebrews, and he is a warrior leader. He carries out the conquest of the land, and according to the biblical account, he takes the city of Jericho, where the walls collapse as some sort of miracle, and the Hebrews are now part of the landscape of Canaan once again. As time goes by, the Hebrews find themselves being the rivals of the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines are these sophisticated people who live in these cities. They are merchants, they are sailors. The Hebrews live in the hills, close to the Philistine towns. So they are fighting back and forth. And there are many stories that come out of that rivalry. One of them is the famous story of Samson. Samson was a champion of the Hebrews. He is stronger than anyone. He killed a lion with his hands. And by the way, there were lions in the Middle East and North Africa at that time. Actually, there were a lot of species in that area that were eventually exterminated, became extinct because of human action. So Samson is very powerful, and he defeats the Philistines every time that he goes to battle with them. So he is seduced by a Philistine woman by the name of Delilah, and she finds out that the secret of his strength is his hair. So as long as Samson has long hair, he has his strength, and if his hair is cut, then he loses his powers. So she seduces him, and one day, while he is sleeping, she cuts his hair, and the Philistines capture him. They take out his eyes, or they pierce his eyes with needles. He goes blind, and and they force him to work like a beast, uh, without the Philistines noticing. The hair of Samson begins to grow, and he recovers his strength. And one day, while the Philistine leaders are celebrating, he uses his strength to bring down the columns that hold the palace, and everyone gets healed, including himself. So you see a lot of stories like this in relation to the Philistines and their uh, connection to the Hebrews. As the narrative continues, the tribes, there are 12 tribes of Israel, 12 Hebrew tribes. They decide that in order to confront the Philistines, they need a ruler, they need a king to unify them. Prior to that, they were led by judges. These are not judges in the modern sense of the word, they were more like warrior leaders. And there was even a female judge, Deborah. Actually, there's a poem about Deborah called The Song of Deborah, and that is probably the oldest section in the Hebrew scriptures. In any case, the judges are not enough. They believe that they need a king like every other state to fight the Philistines, and that king is Saul, who is quite successful at first, but he, according to the biblical story, is a very envious, very insecure king, and it is that insecurity that leads to his defeat. He will be killed on the battlefield by the Philistines. After the death of Saul, there's a little confusion, and out of this confusion, David emerges as the new king of Israel. David is the famous character from the story of David and Goliath, little shepherd boy who challenges this big Philistine warrior, and he takes his slingshot and kills the giant with one shot. David, according to the biblical account, is going to gather a band of followers who eventually will take over what used to be the kingdom of Saul. He will establish a centralized monarchy. He will conquer the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and he will build a palace for himself. This palace will be the center of a very powerful kingdom that will absorb some of the neighboring states that existed there. When David dies, he is succeeded by his son Solomon, and Solomon represents the height of Israelite power and wealth. Solomon is famous for three things: his wisdom, his wealth, and his sexual prowess. So there are all kinds of stories about that. So, for example, the story of a woman, two women with a baby, and they both claim to be the mother. Solomon tells them, well, since I cannot tell who the mother is, let's cut the baby in half. And one of the women says, no, she can have it. And that gives Solomon the clue that this woman is the real mother. There are legends about the mines of King Solomon. He was so wealthy that no one knew where his money came from, his wealth came from. So he must have access to these secret mines that are filled with gold. And then there is the idea of his sexual prowess. Towards the end of his reign, he has hundreds of concubines around him. And he is so famous that the Queen of Sheba, which probably was located in modern day Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula, she travels just to meet him, and she becomes pregnant with his child. She goes back to her land and has a son, and that son, which comes to be known as the Lion of Judah, becomes the ancestor of the emperors of Ethiopia. So under Solomon, Israel becomes this powerful kingdom. And after the death of Solomon, the kingdom splits into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. 10 of the tribes will be in the northern kingdom, and 2 of the tribes in the southern kingdom. And so, if we look at the biblical narrative, by the year 900 BC, this is what the kingdom of Israel would have looked like, which interestingly enough looks very much like what modern Israel looks like, or what some people would like it to look like. This hypothetical kingdom of Israel is independent, centralized, it's powerful, it's very central to what is going on in the area. So a narrative, the biblical narrative, has a very, very interesting beginning. Humble people from far away, destined to travel to this land where they settle, and then they go through ordeals in a foreign land. They come back, they conquer the land, and they establish this brilliant, this brilliant monarchy. One of the things that I didn't mention before is that under Solomon, he also builds a temple. And in this temple, he will house the Ark of the Covenant, which supposedly is this golden chest that contains the tablets given by Moses by God with the commandments. So this narrative is neatly arranged. It seems that this kingdom that you see here was destined to exist, and it is through the will of God that it has come to exist. The question is then, how historically accurate is this biblical narrative? How much of this is historical truth, and how much of this is just legend? And in order to do that, we have to look at the other historical sources that were produced at the time. After all, this land was surrounded by literate societies: Mesopotamians, Ugaritic cities, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Hittites. So by looking at other information about ancient Israel, we can corroborate some of the, or not, some of the narratives in the Bible. Also very important, we have to look at the archaeology, because the archaeology is neutral. The archaeology doesn't have any motives. So by looking at the archaeology, we can see if it reflects the image that is portrayed in the biblical sources. In this image, we see the archaeological excavations at Qeiyafa in modern-day Israel. And this settlement probably is from around the 10th century BC. That is around the time that David and Solomon would have been alive. And what this shows is it's a hilltop town with walls and with a large building complex that may have been some sort of palace. And this is pretty typical of what you find in the area around this period. What this tells you is that the area of Canaan, what came to be a part of the kingdom of Israel, was populated by probably small city-states like this, the local king with a small force, surrounded by some territory for farming, most likely connected also to some of the semi-nomadic tribes that live in the area. And it is these towns that eventually coalesced into forming some of the kingdoms of the area. This area is known by historians as Syria-Palestine. We don't use the term Canaan, that's a biblical term. But as you can see, this might be a more accurate map of what may have existed around 900 BC. So in addition to the kingdom of Israel, we have the kingdom of Judah. According to tradition, when Solomon died, his son inherited the whole kingdom, but then there was some sort of civil war that led to the separation of the kingdom of Israel into two. Kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. But in addition to that, what do you see? You see the Philistine cities. You see the Phoenician states to the north. You see the kingdom of Aram Damascus, the kingdom of Ammon. That's where the Ammonites lived. The kingdom of the Moabites, Moab. The kingdom of the Edomites, Edom. So it is likely that around 900 BC, towns like the one that we saw before started to develop into states. What happened in Mesopotamia thousands of years earlier is now happening here. The consolidation of tribes or city-states into territorial states, into kingdoms. And that leads us to believe that the whole story of David, actually the whole story of Saul, David, and Solomon may be just a legend, because archaeology tells us that there is no powerful centralized state at this point in time. The archaeology tells us that there are small kingdoms that are probably beginning to consolidate into more powerful kingdoms, but nothing like what is described in the biblical account. This stele is called the Mesha stele, and it was produced by King Mesha of Moab, which is one of those kingdoms around Israel. And this stele depicts the accomplishments of the king, including defeating the son of King Omri of Israel. What is important about this is that even though this is a propaganda piece, it does confirm the existence of the dynasty of Omri in Israel. We believe that it is actually under the Omriad dynasty that the real state or the real kingdom of Israel emerges, and that's in the 800s, 100 years after the biblical account. And this is why we take everything before that as semi-historical or legendary. There's no proof of an Abraham, of an Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, or a Moses. These individuals may have existed, or someone with a name like that may have existed. They are part of a collective memory of something that happened, but they are not historical events. And actually, many of these stories sound very much like the stories of other cultures in the area. We have, of course, the comparison between Sargon the Great and Moses, but there are many other stories that have a similarity to those. There's no historical evidence of a Saul, a David, or a Solomon. It is quite likely that there was a David, but he may have been a sort of warlord, someone who ruled over maybe a hilltop city with walls and a little palace, but not the powerful ruler that is depicted in the biblical accounts. Israel, however, the kingdom of Israel, does become very important locally. It's not a great empire, but it's an important local state in the 9th century, in the 800s. And it is at this point that you start to see a presence of this state in other written sources of the period. It is at this time that you start to see archaeological evidence that there is monumental construction. What is monumental construction? Well, when you build a lot of buildings that are big, palaces, temples, to show the power of the king. There's none of that before this period. There is after the dynasty of Omri establishes itself as the rulers of the kingdom of Israel. It shows that it is at this time that you have a real consolidation of power, and Israel, the kingdom of Israel, becomes an important political player in the area. So what happens to the kingdom of Israel? Unfortunately, for a lot of these small kingdoms in Canaan, this is also the time of Assyrian ascendancy. The kingdom of Assyria is going to expand from the year 900, 800 on. And the kingdom of Israel will fall to the Assyrians in the year 722 BC. The smaller kingdom of Judah will survive for another 100 years or so. The smaller kingdom of Judah survived for another 100 years or so after the destruction of the kingdom of Israel. The people of the kingdom of Israel, by the way, they disappear. The Assyrians were famous for their mass deportations. When they conquer a country, they would simply divide its local population, scatter them across their empire. On their way to these places, a lot of them would die. And once these peoples were settled in different parts of the Assyrian Empire, they lost their identity. So the Israelites disappear from history. The kingdom of Judah survives, but in 587 BC, they're conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon on his way to Egypt. And the temple is destroyed and the city is pillaged. It is believed that a significant number of the Jewish population is then deported to Babylon. These people, probably some people use the figure 15,000, we don't really know how many, but most likely people from the upper classes or skilled artisans, people who have something that they can provide to the Babylonians, they are then deported to Babylon, where they will live for a couple of generations. The Babylonian captivity will represent a very important period in the history of the Hebrew or Jewish people. And actually, the term Jewish is more appropriate from this point on because they are no longer Israelites. That kingdom was destroyed. They disappear from history, basically. The Jews are taken captive to Babylon, and that happened to all of these populations that were conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar. This is something that started with the Assyrians, deportation of groups to other places. Now, the Babylonian captivity doesn't mean necessarily that they're slaves. What happens is that they take the upper classes, skilled craftsmen, people who have some use for the Babylonians, and they are sent to live in Babylon. And they form colonies there. So imagine if the United States, conquers Afghanistan, and they decide that everyone who is a nurse or a doctor or an engineer or has some skill is going to be deported to the United States. So they're sent to New York, and there's an area in Brooklyn where these people settle. That's basically what happened to the Jews in terms of the Babylonian captivity. Of course, there are other instances in history where deportation means basically a death march, and in some cases the extermination of people, but that's not necessarily the case here. So they develop in Babylon. It is at this point that you start to see a lot of the writings, the biblical writings, being produced. And then Babylon is conquered by King Cyrus the Great, a Persian king. And Cyrus allows all the groups that had been forced to live in Babylon to go back to their original land. And this piece on the right, this is called the Cyrus Cylinder. It's actually a document. It's a piece of stone that was placed as a foundational stone in a Babylonian temple. And it says that King Cyrus has decided to allow everyone to go back to their lands where they can worship freely, and he's actually given everyone money to build a temple for their god. Cyrus the Great wanted to portray himself as patron of religions, even though the religion of the Jews is not his religion. He wants to allow them to worship freely, and he wants to provide money so that they can build a temple. By doing this, he's showing that he is the legitimate ruler. A good ruler is someone who allows a people to worship their gods, whoever those gods are. So he did this for many people, including the Jews. And if you read the biblical scriptures, Cyrus is portrayed in a very positive light. So under Persian rule, the Jews go back to Jerusalem and they build the second temple. And it is at this point that many of the elements of what we know as the Jewish religion begin to develop. We're going to move forward many centuries, and eventually the land of Canaan is conquered by the Romans. And during the Roman occupation, there will be two pretty violent revolts on the part of the Jews against the Roman authorities. And those revolts are going to be put down very harshly. This will lead to the destruction of the Second Temple of Israel and to the scattering of the Jews outside the land of Canaan. So the Jews don't disappear because they remain in existence as a people, but ever since Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, they are left without a state of their own. There was just a brief period in Hellenistic times when they were able to consolidate a kingdom, and later they are able to have a client kingdom under the Romans. But for the most part, they become a people without a land. What holds them together is a set of beliefs, and these beliefs are contained in their sacred scriptures, and we call these scriptures collectively the Bible. When it comes to the Hebrew scriptures, the most important element is what we call the Torah, or the law, and that includes the books that in the Western tradition are called Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Genesis has the story of creation and the story of Noah, for example. Exodus is the story about how the Hebrews escaped from Egypt and went to the Promised Land. Numbers is lists of genealogies. That these are lists of who is the son of who and who begat who. Leviticus is Leviticus contains a lot of the rituals that are to be practiced by the Hebrew people. And Deuteronomy is a book that basically reassesses the commandments and the rules that God has given to the Hebrews. These 5 books represent the core of the Hebrews' religion and becomes the central point of what we call Judaism today. Now, to understand the Hebrew, what we call the Bible, we have to make a distinction between the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. The Hebrew scriptures are called the Tanakh, and they were compiled in 2 different collections. Very likely the first compilation because remember, these books were not all written at the same time. The books of what we call the Bible were written between the years 900 BC all the way to around 100 BC. That's a long time. And that means that the people who wrote the first books are not the same people who wrote the books that are in the middle or the books that are in the end. The religion of the people who wrote the first books is not the same religion as the religion of the ones who wrote the last books. Religions are not static, they're dynamic, they develop. So you can imagine that over the course of 800 years, the people who produce those scriptures, the people who call themselves either Hebrews or Israelites or Jews, they were not the same people. Of course, they are linked historically, they are linked to a tradition. In some cases, they are linked biologically to the original ones. But look at the United States. The United States is not the same country that was 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 150 or 200 years ago. So we cannot expect that the Hebrew people who appear around the year 900 BC are the same people who lived around the time of Christ. So there's an evolution, right? However, these people around the year 100 BC looked at the writings that have been produced all of this time, and they compiled them into a single collection. A canon means an official collection of writings. The first compilation that takes place around 100 BC is going to have a major impact because it basically defines what the official word of God is. Then later, around the year 100 AD, and this is after the destruction of the Second Temple and after most of the Jews had been expelled from Palestine, a group of scholars that we call the Council of Jabne met and put together another collection that they consider is the official version of what they think are inspired works by God. That collection that came out of the Council of Jabne became the foundation of what the Hebrews today call the Tanakh, or their Bible. The other compilation, the one that was done around 100 BC, is also very important because it's going to have an impact upon the Jews who live outside Palestine and upon Christianity. So what are the Christian scriptures? Well, the Christian scriptures are the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the Hebrew section, and the New Testament is the Gospels, the story of Jesus, the letters of the apostles, the book of the Apocalypse. Everything that has to do with Jesus afterwards is the New Testament. Everything that comes before that is connected to the Hebrews and the kingdom of Israel and the Jews is the Old Testament. The Christian Old Testament is based on something called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is basically a translation of Hebrew texts into Greek. That was started to be put together around 250 BC. What happened is that in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, which was probably one of the most magnificent cities in the world at that time, there was a significant Jewish population. And those Jews in Alexandria no longer spoke Aramaic, which was the language commonly spoken in Palestine. They spoke Greek. so they call Koine Greek, which was a common type of Greek that spread after the conquests of Alexander the Great. So they could not understand the scriptures that had been written mostly in Hebrew, a couple of them in Aramaic, but mostly in Hebrew. For that purpose, they put together a translation. So the Septuagint is the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. When Christianity emerged and they embraced the Old Testament as a revelation from God, they decided to use that Greek translation as a foundation. So today, if you buy a Christian Bible and if you look at the Old Testament, that will be a translation of the Septuagint. If you have a Hebrew Bible, that will come from a compilation that goes back to the year 100 BC and the one that was produced in the Council of Jaffna in 100 AD. What we have in terms of the Bible is basically copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. We don't have the originals of anything. Remember that many of these stories, many of these narratives started as oral tradition, and only later they were put into writing. So the oldest versions of some of the sections in the Hebrew Bible come from around the year 100 BC, and they come from the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the, I think it's 1950s, a shepherd discovered in some caves this pottery, and inside the pottery there were scrolls. And it turns out that a lot of these scrolls were biblical scripture. So the oldest versions that we have of any type of biblical scripture come from that period. Of course, many of these works were older than that. And it is based on that that we have formulated our reconstruction of how these writings came into being as a single collection. And they are very interesting writings. They are, some of it is history, some of them is legend, some of them are poetry, others are law, some texts are legends that come from other traditions, and they were incorporated into the traditions of the Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. So the value of these scriptures is not to take them literally, the stories are great. The Bible as literature is amazing. It's an extremely rich text, but we cannot take everything that is there as historically accurate. However, we can fish some information out of that. We can derive some information corroborated with other sources that we have from other writings outside the Hebrew tradition, and match that with what we know archaeologically. And through a combination of those things, we can eventually create a real image of what the historical past was.